So in this episode, we're going to be focusing on Sector 4, which is going to be turns 13 and 14. Well, turns 12, 13, and 14. 12 becomes a bit easy to forget for me because it's actually like one really long curve that you're taking flat out. But nonetheless, turns 12, 13, and 14. And in this episode, I might get a little bit more technical, maybe because this section is in fact more technical in some ways, or maybe because the way I'm progressing through this whole thing, I'm just becoming more technically oriented. Nonetheless, there are some technical points in this sector that definitely need to be pointed out. So start with turn 12. Turn 12 is just one long right-handed sweeping curve, which you're going to take flat out. And I think the approach is going to be wide, staying on the outside of 12, and then bringing it in, which is actually going to be the outside of turn 13. So using this wide sweeping turn and sort of sacrificing its apex, so to speak, to set yourself up to the outside of what will become turn 13 going into turn 14. Speaking of these two turns, what makes these two turns really important to focus on are two major points. One, similar to Sector 1, where turns 1 and 2 were really close together, turns 13 and 14 here don't have a lot of space between them, which means they'll probably end up turning into one sort of pseudo-turn. The other, which is going to be a bit of an Achilles heel for me, is the angles of these turns. Turn 13 has a greater angle than 90 degrees, and turn 14 is more acute, so it's less than 90 degrees. Which means the apices of these turns I'm going to have to be very cognizant of, or to be more precise, I'm going to have to be cognizant of where I place my apex for each of these two turns. And then there's the fact that if you pay attention to turn 14, coming out of turn 14, you have a fairly long, generous straightaway, which means that the exit of turn 14 is going to determine how much I can optimize the use of that straightaway, which also means setting myself up through turns 12 and, more importantly, 13 to put myself in the best position for 14 to use the straightaway is going to be very important. But it ain't that simple, because turn 14 ain't a flat turn. So here you notice over there on the left, I can't see the exit. And not because it's the end of the screen, but because the track is dropping and there's some green now. This seems tricky because I have to figure out when I'm going to hit the throttle, and I can't really see my track out point. But anyway, coming out of that turn towards the outside and using the green. All right, let's try it. Okay. So on the plus side, all of the practice we've been doing up until now leaves me with enough sort of awareness of the track and of the driving line to avoid getting a bronze. I'm hitting silver, but I just need to fine-tune a couple of things here. And so fine-tune I did. Now when it comes to a turn like 14, which is blind, or any blind turn that you come across, you need to have points that you refer to when you're driving. I like to call these reference points. It's a term I've made up and has never been used before in driving. So turn 13 is going to be slightly earlier of an apex than I would otherwise anticipate, because I want it to put me out here to come into turn 14 without really turning it into two separate turns. So the trick is going to be figuring out the right point to brake for 13 to sweep me enough through to get to a track out point that sets me up to continue the curve rather than create a second turn going into 14. But then going into 14 again becomes the tricky part of knowing when to start accelerating. Looking for reference points here. On the outside here, pretty much. Okay, here we go. So on the right, you've got a guy waving a green flag in stand 22, in post 22, whatever that is. As soon as that disappears from the right of the screen, that's step one. Also, right at that point, if you look, you can see just the end of the inside curbing here. And then right a foot later, you can start to see the green outer curbing coming out of 14. So I think that's going to be the point at which I accelerate, which means that's going to be the point I need to prepare for. I need to make sure that the car is as stable as possible when I'm approaching that point in time, because if I'm not stable and I start accelerating, I'm gonna spin. Like that. So here we go, coming into turn 14, and pay attention to the reference points as they pass. The first reference point that we're going to pass by is the booth to the right, booth 22. Almost immediately after, we see that the inside curbing, we can see the end of it. And then almost immediately after that, we see the beginning of the green of the outside exit curbing. So the following footage is just going to be demonstrations of me actually putting these reference points into effect. And what I want to actually make a point of as I talk over some of these clips is just how quickly these reference points come in succession at speed. This is what really highlights that your eyes need to be where you want to end up going, because you need to take that information in way earlier, because when it comes quickly, and when it goes just as quickly. I seem to be onto something here. Now, the next few clips are just going to be super boring because it's just going to be me successively applying these things that I'm picking up over and over again, and my times will continue to come down. Not boring for me, but going to be probably boring for you. But I do want you to pay attention to some of the errors that are popping up that I'm not necessarily highlighting. This one might be really good. Ooh, better. Oh, 25.736. Now, one of the things that stood out to me here, you can see, or at least I could see, why that ended up happening. I was kind of wide on that apex, but even if you were to take away me being so wide on that apex and move that line in, it was way too early. And I was early on the apex of turn 13 as well. So it was just a domino effect that ultimately pushed me off the track, similar to Sector 1. If you notice on that last one, I started to sort of tighten up my line. I did end up a little bit more on the grass. I did use more of the width on the exit track out points, but ultimately using the reference points and tightening up that line and using the track the way I could got me to a point where I could stabilize and rein in my speed for turn 14 which ended up affecting the exit from 14 to the straightaway. Getting the speed slower going through a turn than previous attempts doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be slower through the sector. It could potentially mean that I have more control, which gets me on throttle earlier and gets my times faster. So, trail braking all the way through to the exit point of 13, and then slight maintenance throttle, and then off throttle towards the apex of 14 with a little bit of braking to just get that speed just where I need it to be. And now again, using these next few clips to make the point that you can probably notice there are errors that I'm making on these particular attempts. Not hitting the apex where I need to, being a little bit too wide, not being at the right speed, or maybe braking too much. But ultimately you notice that my times are relatively near my best time, even when I nearly spun. So while there is still a ton of room for improvement, I think with the basic approach that I've got, I think I'm on the right track. No pun intended. Can he do it again? Oh, you bet he can. I'd say that's it. It's working. What more can I say? You watched the times come down. Now, granted, you probably are over there hitting way better sector times than that, but at the end of the day, the time was one thing and it came down to another thing. So I'm going in the right pace. Let's see what the next sector looks like. We're getting very, very close to doing our lap attack and getting into that race. And hopefully all of this stuff applies with a bunch of other cars in the way.